Welcome to the System Simplified podcast, where we feature top leaders who share stories on how to successfully systemize a business. Now, let's get started with the show.
Hello, Adi Klevit here, the host of the System Simplified podcast, where I feature top founders, entrepreneurs, and thought leaders about systematizing a business. And today's episode is being brought to you by Business Success Consulting Group, where we create, document, optimize, and implement processes and procedures so businesses can grow and thrive. And today's guest is Hamid Ghanadan. Hi, Hamid.
Hi.
Great having you on this podcast. We're going to have a fantastic conversation about systematizing a topic or a subject that usually is being looked at as more creative and impossible to systematize. But we're going to see how those two combine, and that's the subject of marketing. So we're going to look at science and marketing in the same conversation, which is very exciting. And I am going to, first of all, start with your bio, if that's okay.
Of course. Sounds great. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so you are the CEO and founder of Linus. And
That's right.
You are working with ambitious companies in science and health, because you came from that background. So you're working with ambitious companies in science and health, with nearly 30 years of expertise and models published in 3 books. Your firm has guided commercial strategies for startup like Twist Bioscience and 10x Genomics, and you launched key business units at Thermo Fisher and many others, right? I mean, known names, and you help clients crack the code on persuading professional skeptics, which I think it's a great conversation because we all have professional skeptics, whether we're working with health and science. I mean, our listeners are listening to right now, and you might even run an HVAC company and you are going into a home of a professor from a university or a thermodynamic professor, and they know everything about they need to know about, the airflow in the house, and, there are skeptics, and you have to be able to persuade them that you are the expert, and then you know what you're doing, and that you have the best, equipment or whatnot. So I think it applies to everyone. So
I think it does. I think it does as well. So
yeah, totally. So the first thing I'm curious about is your story. So you started as a biochemist.
I did.
Yeah. And then you became a marketer.
I did.
So tell us about that journey.
How did I go from one to the other? Yeah, absolutely.
Yes.
I was a young biochemist. I was working at a lab in an academic institution. And this was during the time when the internet was just beginning to form. I mean, quite literally in the mid 90s, I remember getting my first email address, and I remember the first websites starting to pop up. And my initial interest was around helping use technology to communicate science better. So I was working with all my colleagues, and I noticed that we were talking about these really beautiful, multi-dimensional, like 6, 7, 8-dimensional systems. Biological systems have multiple dimensions. There's time aspect, there's all these different facets. And the tools that they had in order to teach or communicate them were 2-dimensional, using words, using like quite literally a blackboard. I remember once a professor trying to use tubes to show how DNA unfolds and the tensile strength of the end at each end when it's unfolding. And I'm just like, there's got to be a better way. There's got to be a better way. Like there's all these other tools. Well, in education and in publishing, there was no road, because both of those industries at the time were very protective of their moat that they built. And so I very quickly found myself in marketing, because the companies that had to describe the science through marketing and were invested in describing their products, through communicating science, were very open to using new technologies to do it. But as soon as I got my hands in there and I started to work on, I quite literally approached some companies that are now billion-dollar companies to convince them to build their very first website, for example. So, I did a lot of work in that front. But the application and the use of technology very quickly became kind of boring to me personally. What I started to focus in on was trying to sense a pattern for how people were making decisions, because that's ultimately what you're trying to do. If you're in the business of communications, you're trying to, there's like one of four reasons why we communicate. There's communication for a relationship, there's communication for understanding, but really there's communication for action. Like I'm communicating with you because I hope that you will take an action, or I'm communicating right now with your audience on your podcast, and my hope is that they take some action. And, in this particular case, I want them to look at my book to see if it's relevant to them. But people don't do what you tell them to do. Human beings are, we take action based on behavioral patterns. We don't take action based on information and logic.
So, Hamid,
And
let
so
me ask
that's
you a
where
question.
became my interest.
No, definitely. I mean, and I can see how you were shifting from one to another. I like that connection as well. I mean, I'm an industrial engineer, and the connection between science and understanding people, that's what drew me to begin with to actually study industrial engineering. That was very interesting to me. So I understand. And I think you're also breaking the myth that scientists or engineers or people that are very analytical cannot be good communicators, because it's not true. You can definitely be a good communicator. But you know that there is the stigma out there that say, oh yeah, you just like, but it's not true. You can definitely communicate. You just have to communicate correctly. So it seems to me that when you are trying to sell to people that are skeptical, people that are more analytical, you will have to sell them. They're professional. They're basically professional buyers. You have to be more factual. There will be less of that emotional connection, although we are all people and different people, so you can have some that will more connect emotionally. But I think overall it will be more showing facts, right? And being more factual. Is that correct?
So you can't get away with any kind of a decision in a technical setting without showing the facts behind the story. But what most people think of as how they would go about selling to a technical audience is actually a myth. And
Right.
that
So
myth
tell me,
is,
what do they think? Let's bust
yeah,
that myth. But what is the number one misconception on how to sell to a highly technical skilled audience?
show them the data.
Okay.
That's the biggest myth. That is the
They
biggest
want
myth.
data. That I come to you and I sell to you, you are a tech company, and I was go, okay, these are the specs, this is what I'm gonna do, and it's like super boring, and you're falling asleep in the middle of my presentation.
Exactly. That's precisely it. And because the scientist or the doctor or the engineer, because they deal with data as part of their decision-making cycle, doesn't necessarily mean that you as a marketer, you as a seller, you as a colleague, you as anybody are actually convincing them based on the data. You actually have to use a different construct in order to put the data in the right time. You have to introduce the data in the right time. So without context, what data does in technical settings is it actually creates a divide. It creates skepticism, right? So if you've gotten a PhD in any kind of a scientific field, the last thing that you have to do is called a defense, right? And that's basically when you show your data and then you become under attack by people whose job it is to make sure that you didn't make a mistake. And so in a sales situation, if you just show up with the data, that you activate all of those habits from your customer, right? Their job becomes to make sure that you didn't unturn any stone. They're trying to find the bias. They're trying to find the weak point. And so
I
you're
want to say
actually quite
something.
literally, yeah.
So on that one, it's not only technical people. It's not only when you do with tech and health. It can be with buyers in general. Depends, try to sell to a salesperson. They will sit there and look at your presentation and try to find all the holes or defend back. So I think we're talking here more about defending or people that are more the skeptical buyer, wherever they are coming from.
So skepticism is a human natural reaction to information. You're absolutely right. When you're in science, when you're in engineering, when you're in medicine, you have learned skills about how to be skeptical about data. And those skills are really sort of sharpened the more seasoned that you are. So that's why I call them professional skeptics, because they've been taught how to become skeptical of information. They're truly like in that mode. They're not looking for, I forget the term, but their logic is one of falsification, not necessarily of like proof. So they're working on a completely different logic than the salesperson is working on.
Okay,
And
so we identified the myth is, yeah, we're gonna bust that myth that you need to come to start with data. So how do you actually approach it? What will be your system of approaching?
Yeah. So I asked myself that same question, and I said, okay, if scientists are very skeptical, is skepticism on a spectrum, and what's the opposite end of that spectrum? If skepticism is being closed to information, then curiosity is the other end of the spectrum. And curiosity is also a necessary part of science, engineering, and medicine. Because if we didn't have curiosity, and if we didn't learn how to be curious as scientists and engineers, or anybody, to your point, then we would have never made any observations. We would have never made any discovery. We'd still be working on the very first discovery as like a species, right? And so now I've got this tool that I can actually help take skeptical people out of their skepticism and bring them into curiosity. And then I would, through narrative and story, give them what they need in order to answer to themselves the questions that arise the moment that they're curious, in order to then formally and in a structured way give them the data so that they can validate their own hypothesis. That's the whole thing. It's not necessarily that data, and you mentioned this, you're not going to get away without using data, but you are going to get away with shaping the perceptions and hopefully having a mutually beneficial outcome between you and whoever it is that you're trying to persuade, or you and who you're trying to inspire, if you just use the right sort of model for how to communicate. So this is relevant to everybody, not just salespeople.
So Hamid, give me an example. Give me an example of how that works in sales.
Sure. So we had a client who came to us and they had a fantastic new product that they were selling into the hospitals. It's a ventilator. And so heaven forbid people get on a ventilator. It's usually because they've had some sort of a traumatic event in their lives. And the body can't really sustain breathing on its own. So it needs mechanical help for a short period of time. And being on a ventilator is incredibly agitating if you're conscious, even if you're not conscious, because a typical ventilator only sort of aspirates and dispenses air in very rhythmic fashion. But the human body is based on biological metabolism. And so one minute you may want 14 breaths, another minute you want 18 breaths. And when you want that, when your body craves that air, it's not there. Or when you're not done taking that air and metabolizing it, it gets sucked out of your lung and more air gets pushed in. So it's really agitating. Imagine scuba diving where you're not in control of when you take a breath and when you exhale. Is that there's a machine that's doing it. It's incredibly agitating. So our client had this device where it basically sensed when the body is ready, and it would activate the ventilator at the same time. And they went into the hospital and nobody cared. And they were like, "What? We've solved a big problem." Nobody cared. And so the salespeople were going in there talking about patient asynchrony, right? That's the problem that they're trying to solve. And when we went in and when we did observational studies, so my company, we do a lot of deep insight work. So we do a lot of market research, but like deep sort of ethnographic work and psychological work. And when we went in there, we noticed that the doctor wasn't feeling asynchrony. The nurse technician or the respiratory technician wasn't feeling asynchrony. And the patient is not in a state to actually make any decisions or talk, but they're the ones that are feeling all the pain. And we also then identified what the barrier was. And that barrier is that the care provider just sedates the patient. And that's actually bad for the patient because now they have to stay on the ventilator longer and other problems could occur. So we told the salespeople, don't go in and start talking about patient asynchrony and showing them all the data. Go in there and say, how often does oversedation happen in your ICU? And we noticed the moment that the sales rep went into the ICU and said, how often does oversedation happen? Everyone sort of sat up straight. They're like, who are you with? Why are you interested in this? They became immediately like they dropped what they were doing and they zoomed right in because it was such a big problem and such a big story. And so then the salesperson would say, well, there's actually 5 different causes for oversedation, and ventilator asynchrony is actually one of them. How often are you sedating a patient that's on a ventilator? And they were like, well, yeah, it happens from time to time. I'm like, okay, well, here's another way. And this is where you use human language. Instead of talking about asynchrony and all this stuff, we encouraged the salespeople to say, our ventilator breathes like a human. That's all we said. Our ventilator breathes like a human. And this is how it does it, right? So you back into the data. Once you've oriented your audience, you have to orient your audience. You have to get them to care. And then you have to give them information to form a hypothesis on their own so that they're interested in the outcome of the story. Those are the 2 key pieces and so that's an example of how we did it.
That's beautiful. And that ties into what you also promote a lot in terms of the storytelling, because the storytelling is the connection for that. It's the human connection. You hear the story and you can identify with it. And obviously, when you're presenting it, I mean, it's a third party, because it's not, when you're selling directly to the consumer that has the pain, it's a different thing. Here you have to create that story, that emotional connection, and that responsibility from a third party that they have to care enough that the patient that they have, they're actually over-sedating, because they can become also numb to that problem.
Oh, absolutely. And they have become numb to that problem. And You're right. The thing about storytelling is that it's become such a sort of a trendy topic. But story is actually a technology that's co-evolved with the human brain through millennia. And if you think of it as a technology, then there's a system for how you can actually systematically tell the story to get the response that you want and to get the intended action. So it's not
Let
just
me ask you a question on that.
time.
So systematically, like in very briefly, and I want the listeners to then go to your website, read your books, like really understand, but what is the main characteristics of a good storytelling?
Yeah, it's actually not even my work. We've just adopted the hero's journey essentially to our to technical markets, but everyone has a story running in their own mind in which they're the hero of that story. You have it, I have it, all of your listeners have it, we all have it. If any piece of information taps into that narrative, taps into that movie, and makes that hero go through trials and tribulations and be more successful in their minds, that's the story that gets action. So how do you do it? Very quickly, very briefly. Number 1, you have to align with the goals. You have to understand the goal of your audience. What is it that you're trying to achieve, right? Where is this hero trying to go? And then the second one is, what's a barrier that they didn't see they had? That's the hook. That's the curiosity, right? For a scientist, it's like you're trying to cure cancer. But did you notice that this and that? And that this and that is the orientation of like exposing a hidden problem or a hidden danger or a perspective that they hadn't taken into account. So that's sort of the main part that engages, that hypnotizes your audience. The way that a movie hypnotizes the audience. There's a moment where something happens and now you're in this supernatural world and you're like, whoa, where am I going? But then you're you're mirroring whoever it is that the hero is in the story. Same thing happens when you do that in a technical conversation. So the HVAC guy who's going in and selling, even though it's not a professor of thermodynamics, you gotta get the story in a way that
It creates curiosity and interest. Yeah.
Exactly. And then you have to feed the questions that come up in that whole thing. Like, this is a new idea. Is it relevant to me? Can I do something about it? What will happen if I do something about it? What are the risks of doing something about it? That's that middle zone of the story. That's the act two. The act two is called the struggle, right? You have to give room for your customer to struggle with those questions. You can just give them the information, right? But you can't actually do this. Many times in the hero's journey in movies and stories, the main hero has a sidekick, a friend, a helper, right? That helper never gets anything done. They're just there to serve those questions to the hero. Like, hey, are you okay? Are you moving forward? Can I give you any more information? That's your role as a seller in that moment, is to allow your customer to answer those questions for themselves. And then you deliver the action. That's the last piece. This is how you, as the person, can get closer to your goal if you start by taking this action. So you start listening to anything. You start listening to podcasts, to articles, to books, to novels, to whatever. They all follow this. The ones that are successful all follow this arc. The reason why advertising fails is because it doesn't have an act two. It does not have an act.
You have to have the action, yes.
Act two is the most important part of the story.
It is, but you have to build the story to get there. Absolutely.
Absolutely. So that's what
has been systems for sure. And that has been a great conversation here with a lot of information. So if our listeners would like to know more and reach out to you, how can they do that?
Yeah, absolutely. So our website is called thelinusgroup.com. And you can also find me on LinkedIn, Hamid Ghanadan on LinkedIn. I'm also pretty active. I would welcome, a ping on either of those platforms.
That's incredible. And we'll include it in the show notes. So I want to thank you for being a guest on this podcast and for this lively and interesting conversation. Thank you so much.
Oh, it's been my pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the System Simplified podcast. We'll see you again next time, and be sure to click subscribe to get future episodes.